Jack Morrison starts his morning like any other day at the Triple R Ranch. Coffee in hand, he heads out to check his fences. What he finds stops him in his tracks. A luxury car smashed into his fence, empty. No driver in sight, just some footprints leading towards his house and a designer handbag half buried in the dirt. Inside the bag, he finds a wallet with $50,000 in cash and a strange note. If found, please destroy this bag. When a muddy, limping woman shows up at his door, asking to use his phone, Jack faces a choice. Help a stranger in need or ask the questions burning in his mind. What will he discover when he learns who she really is? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound ledger sat open on Jack's kitchen table, its worn pages telling a story of struggle in red ink. He'd been staring at the numbers for an hour before the crashed Mercedes interrupted his morning ritual. Now, as he approached the limping woman, those figures haunted the back of his mind. 3 months behind on the feed payments, irrigation system failing, and the bank getting increasingly impatient with his promises. "Ma'am," he called out, keeping his distance. The woman turned, revealing a face that somehow managed to look elegant, despite being smudged with dirt, and what might have been blood from a small cut above her eyebrow. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," she said, her voice carrying an accent that definitely wasn't Wyoming. "I just need to use a phone. Mine was lost in the accident." Jack studied her. Designer jeans caked with mud, an expensive-looking blouse torn at the shoulder, and the kind of bearing that spoke of boardrooms rather than barns. Everything about her screamed money, which made that $50,000 in his pocket feel even heavier. "Come on in," he said finally, gesturing toward the house. "Got a first aid kit inside. Miguel," he called out to his ranch hand, who was already heading toward the crashed car. "Check if she left anything else important in that wreck." Inside, Jack's kitchen told its own story of a life lived simply but with care. The coffee pot was ancient but spotless, the wooden table scarred but solid, and photos on the wall traced a family history going back 3 generations on the same land. He pulled out a chair for her, noting how she hesitated before sitting, as if unused to such plain furniture. "I'm Jack Morrison," he said, retrieving the first aid kit from under the sink. "And you are?" "Jane," she said, after a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. "Jane Smith." Jack almost smiled at the obviousness of the lie. He'd been raising cattle long enough to know when something spooked an animal, and this woman was definitely spooked. He dampened a clean cloth and handed it to her. "Well, Jane Smith, why don't you clean up a bit while I make some fresh coffee? Then maybe we can talk about what really brought you to my fence at 6 in the morning." He turned to the stove, giving her space while keeping her in his peripheral vision. The ledger caught his eye again, particularly the latest entry from yesterday's mail. The development company's offer had gone up again, $5 million for the ranch, well above market value. On paper, it was the answer to all his problems. The coffee pot sputtered to life as Jane dabbed at her face. Jack pulled out his mother's old ceramic mugs, the ones with the faded ranch brand on the side. Behind him, papers rustled. She was looking at the ledger. "These numbers," she said, softly. "You're underwater on your operations costs." Jack turned sharply. Most people wouldn't be able to make sense of his chicken-scratch bookkeeping, let alone draw conclusions that quick. Jane wasn't meeting his eyes anymore, suddenly very interested in cleaning a non-existent spot on her sleeve. "Ranching's been tough lately," he said carefully. "Drought's hitting everyone hard, but some harder than others," she replied, her fingers tracing the column of red figures. "Your irrigation system is failing, and the cost to repair it would be," she squinted at his notes, "about equal to your annual profit from the last good year." Jack set the coffee down harder than necessary. "For someone who needs to use a phone, you sure seem interested in my books." The woman, Jane, finally met his eyes. Something shifted in her expression, a calculation happening behind those shrewd eyes. "Mr. Morrison, What if I told you I might be able to help with your financial situation? I'd say that's mighty generous for someone who won't even tell me her real name. A knock at the door interrupted whatever she was about to say. Miguel stood there holding up a laptop bag retrieved from the car. Jefe, you might want to see this. Inside the bag was a corporate ID badge partially melted from what looked like deliberate damage, but the photo was clear enough. The woman, sitting at his kitchen table, much more polished but unmistakable. The name read, Claire Harrison, CEO, Harrison Tech Industries. Jack looked up to find her watching him intently, all pretense gone from her face. "All right," she said quietly. "I suppose we should start over. But before I explain everything, I need to know, can I trust you, Mr. Morrison?" The sound of approaching vehicles on his access road answered for him. Through the window, he could see 3 black SUVs kicking up dust as they sped toward the ranch. Claire, not Jane, stiffened at the sight. "Looks like we're about to find out," Jack said, sliding the ledger closed. "Back doors through the mudroom. Miguel will show you where to hide. We'll talk about trust after I deal with whatever this is." As Miguel led her away, Jack caught one last glimpse of his mysterious guest. For the first time, he saw real fear in her eyes. Somehow, that made him trust her more than any explanation could have. The ledger sat closed on the table, its pages holding more red ink than black. But something told him that whatever story was about to unfold would change those numbers one way or another. He just hoped he was making the right choice. Through the slats of the barn's hayloft, Claire watched the 3 black SUVs circle the ranch house like vultures. Her fingers instinctively went to her pocket where her phone should have been, her lifeline to her old world, now lying in pieces. Somewhere between here and the crash site, she'd smashed it herself after sending one final encrypted message to her most trusted ally. "Going dark. If I don't make contact in 30 days, release everything." Below, Jack Morrison stood in his doorway, every inch the weathered rancher, in his worn boots and faded denim. She couldn't hear what he was saying to the men in dark suits, but his body language told the story. Casual, unbothered, one hand hooked in his belt loop, as if this was just another morning chat about the weather. "They're from Quantum Securities," Miguel whispered beside her. "They've been sniffing around the ranch for months, claiming to represent real estate interests." Claire's heart clenched. Quantum Securities was a front company for her own board of directors. She should know. She'd signed off on their creation 5 years ago, never imagining they'd be used against her. The men finally returned to their vehicles, dust rising behind them as they departed. Claire counted to 100 before letting out the breath she'd been holding. When Jack appeared in the barn doorway minutes later, his casual demeanor had vanished. "Want to tell me why corporate security thugs are asking about a woman fitting your description?" he asked, climbing the ladder to the hayloft. "And why they're carrying photos of Claire Harrison, CEO of Harrison Tech Industries, who, according to them, disappeared 3 days ago after what they're calling a concerning mental break." Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out the shattered remains of her phone. Because sometimes the only way to see the truth is to disconnect from the lies. She let the pieces fall through her fingers. "My father built Harrison Tech from nothing. His biggest fear was that success would change us, make us forget where we came from. After he died last year, I discovered some board members were using the company for things he never would have approved." "What kinds of things?" "The kind that destroy small communities like yours. They've been using shell companies to force family farms and ranches into bankruptcy, then buying the land for tech campuses and data centers." She met his eyes. "The development company pressuring you? That's them. They want your water rights more than your land." Jack settled onto a hay bale processing this. "So you, what? Decided to play runaway CEO?" "I needed proof, and I needed to understand what was happening on the ground. For 6 months I've been traveling incognito, visiting the communities they've targeted." She smiled wryly. "Though I usually don't make such a dramatic entrance. The crash wasn't an accident, was it?" "No." Someone tampered with my brakes. I barely made that turn into your fence instead of going over the cliff." She wrapped her arms around herself. The morning. Chill seeping in. I have evidence that could stop them, but I needed to disappear long enough to get it to the right people. I didn't expect them to track me this quickly. Jack stood and shrugged off his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. The gesture, so simple and unthinking, made her throat tight. When was the last time someone had shown her kindness without an agenda? "Your fancy corporate types? They never checked the back 40, he said. "Too busy looking important to do a proper search. But they'll be back. I should go. I've already put you at risk." Running scared never fixed anything. He gestured to the broken phone. "Sometimes things need to break before they can be fixed right. My late wife Sarah used to say that." "Tell me about her?" Claire asked, pulling his jacket closer. A shadow crossed Jack's face, but he sat back down. "She was a teacher. Loved this ranch almost as much as I do. Used to say the land tells you what it needs, if you just learn to listen." He looked out through the barn slats. "Lost her to cancer 3 years ago. Bills from that are part of why I'm in this mess." Claire touched the jacket's worn sleeve. "I'm sorry, both for your loss and for my company's part in what came after. You're not responsible for what others do in your name." He stood, offering her his hand. "Come on. If you're staying, we need to get you set up proper. Got a cabin out back where Sarah's mother used to live. It ain't fancy, but it's private." She took his hand, calloused and strong, so different from the manicured handshakes of her corporate world. "Why are you helping me?" "Because 20 years ago, a stranger helped me rebuild after a tornado took half my herd. Out here, we look after our own." He paused on the ladder. "And maybe, just maybe, you're exactly what this old ranch needs. Someone who knows how to fight back against men in expensive suits." As they crossed the sunlit barnyard, Claire felt the weight of her broken phone like a phantom limb. But, for the first time in months, disconnected from the digital world that had consumed her life, she felt surprisingly whole. Sometimes, she thought, touching the rough wool of Jack's jacket, you have to lose everything to find what matters. Miguel was waiting by the cabin, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I put fresh sheets on the bed, Senora." "CEO, just Claire," she corrected, then turned to Jack. "I don't suppose there's any work I could help with. I'm tired of hiding." Jack's weathered face creased into a smile. "Funny you should ask. Got about a mile of fence needs mending, thanks to someone's creative parking." For the first time since the crash, Claire laughed. It felt foreign and wonderful, like remembering how to speak a language she'd forgotten she knew. Behind them, the ranch house stood solid against the Wyoming sky, its windows reflecting the morning sun like a promise of new beginnings. Miguel found the newspaper while cleaning out the crashed Mercedes. It was folded neatly in the glove compartment, last Sunday's edition of the Wall Street Journal, with Claire's photo splashed across the business section. Tech titans troubled. Legacy, Harrison Industries CEO vanishes amid speculation of corporate coup. He brought it to Jack, who was watching Claire attempt to hammer a fence post back into place. Her technique was terrible, but her determination was something to behold. She'd insisted on helping repair the damage from her crash, even after he told her to rest. "Jefe," Miguel said quietly, handing over the paper. "You should see this." Jack scanned the article, his expression darkening. The story painted a picture far more complex than Claire had shared. Harrison Industries wasn't just any tech company. It was a global giant worth billions, with fingers in everything from artificial intelligence to renewable energy. And Claire Harrison wasn't just its CEO. She was its heart and soul, the daughter who had taken her father's modest software company and transformed it into a powerhouse. But there were shadows in the story. Mentions of boardroom battles, of Claire's increasingly vocal opposition to certain company initiatives, of her father's mysterious final message before his death: "Trust no one but her." "Your fence-mending technique needs work," Jack called out, folding the paper and walking over to Claire. She turned, wiping sweat from her brow, and froze when she saw what he was holding. "Ah," she said softly, "I suppose we should talk." They settled on the tailgate of his truck, the newspaper between them. Claire touched her father's photo in the article, her fingers lingering on his familiar smile. "Dad always said money changes people," she began. "He built the company on 3 principles: innovation, integrity, and impact. Real impact, not just profit. When he got sick, things started changing. Board members I thought I could trust began, pushing for more aggressive expansion, less oversight." "Like buying up ranches through shell companies?" Jack asked. Claire nodded. "That's just the surface. They're after water rights, vast tracts of land for secret projects, things that would never pass public scrutiny. I started investigating after I found encrypted communications between board members and some very dangerous people, the kind of people who tamper with brake lines." "Yes," she met his eyes. "The night before my disappearance, I received a warning from an anonymous source inside the company. The board was planning to have me declared mentally unfit, claim I was having a breakdown from grief over my father's death. They had doctors on payroll ready to sign the papers. I would have been locked away in a private facility while they dismantled everything my father built." Jack absorbed this, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "The money in your bag, that's not nearly enough to fight something like this." "No, but it's enough to survive until I can access what I need." She pulled a small key from around her neck. "There's a safety deposit box in Jackson. Inside is everything I've gathered over the past year. Proof of corruption, illegal dealings, environmental violations. Enough to bring down half the board. I just need time to get it to the right people." "Why haven't you?" "Because the moment I do, people will die." Her voice cracked slightly. "Not just board members. My father's death. It wasn't cancer like they claimed. He was murdered. The doctor who was going to come forward with proof had a mysterious heart attack the day before his scheduled meeting with the FBI. The wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain. Jack studied the woman beside him, seeing past the CEO facade to something far more human. "Your daddy raised you right," he said finally. "Standing up for what's right, even when it costs you." "Everything." "Not everything," she said quietly. "I still have my conscience. And now, maybe, a friend?" Before Jack could respond, Miguel's whistle cut through the air, their warning signal. More vehicles approaching. "Local sheriff this time," Miguel called out, "and he's got company." Through his binoculars, Jack could make out 2 patrol cars and another black SUV. Claire tensed beside him. "That'll be Raymond Walsh, our head of security. He can smell a lie at 50 paces. Then we don't lie." Jack handed her back the newspaper. "We just don't tell the whole truth. Far as anyone knows, you're Jane Smith, a friend of my late wife's family, helping out at the ranch while passing through. They won't believe that. They don't have to believe it. They just have to not be able to prove otherwise." He smiled, slightly. "Besides, where you swing that hammer, nobody'd mistake you for a CEO." That startled a laugh out of her. "I'm getting better." "Sure you are. Now go get cleaned up while I handle this. And Claire," she turned back, "we'll figure this out. Your daddy wasn't the only one who believed in doing what's right." She nodded once, clutching the newspaper to her chest before hurrying toward the cabin. Jack watched her go, thinking about his own father's words from long ago. "Son, sometimes God puts people in your path for a reason. Your job is to figure out if you're meant to help them or if they're meant to help you." Looking at his broken fence and the approaching cars, Jack had a feeling the answer might be both. The leather work gloves felt foreign in Claire's hands. Stiff, unyielding, nothing like the supple leather of her designer handbags. Jack had handed them to her that morning, with a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Sarah's old ones," he'd said, "might help with those blisters you're trying to hide." After the sheriff's visit yesterday, they'd settled into an uneasy routine. The official story had held, barely. Sheriff Thompson clearly didn't believe Jane Smith was who she claimed to be, but he also couldn't prove otherwise. The corporate security man, Walsh, had been harder to fool. His eyes had lingered on Claire too long, his questions too precise. But in the end, they'd left with nothing but suspicions. Now, as dawn painted the mountains gold, Claire struggled with a hay bale, the new gloves protecting her already raw hands. 3 days of ranch work had left her muscles screaming and her designer clothes ruined, but somehow she felt more alive than she had in years. "You're thinking too much," Jack called from the barn door. "Let the gloves do the work. They know the way." "Gloves don't know anything," Claire muttered, but she tried to relax her grip. To her surprise, the bale moved easier. "Oh, funny how that works, isn't it?" Jack moved beside her, his own gloves worn to a buttery softness. "Sometimes you have to trust the tools that came before you. These gloves?" Sarah broke them in on 1,000 bales, taught them every trick there is to know about ranch work. Now they're trying to teach you if you'll let them. Claire looked down at the gloves, seeing them differently now. Each scuff and stain was a lesson learned, each worn spot a victory earned. "Your wife must have been remarkable." "She was." Jack's voice softened. "Would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for pretense either." A comfortable silence fell between them as they worked, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the old barn. Claire found herself falling into a rhythm, her body learning what her mind couldn't grasp. The gloves seemed to guide her hands, showing her how to grip, when to yield, how to work with the hay instead of fighting it. Miguel appeared with coffee mid-morning, his eyes twinkling. "The Senora CEO is becoming a real ranch hand," he observed, handing them each a steaming mug. "Next week, perhaps we teach you to ride?" "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Claire laughed, but the idea thrilled her. Everything here was so tangible, so real, such a contrast to the digital empires she'd spent her life building. "Actually," Jack said, "might not be a bad idea. Way those corporate types kept looking at your car, they'll be back. Might need a vaster getaway plan than walking." The reminder of danger sobered them all. Claire pulled off the gloves, running her fingers over their worn surface. "I should check the security drops I set up. It's been 5 days since I sent that message. If anyone's trying to help me, they'll use the protocols I established." "Use Miguel's laptop in the tack room," Jack said. "Signals bounce through. The Wi-Fi repeater we use for the cattle monitoring system, harder to trace." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Morrison. Modern ranching's not all horses and hay bales." He took a sip of coffee. "Besides, Sarah was the tech-savvy one. Set most of it up before—" He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "Anyway, check what you need to check. Miguel and I'll keep watch." In the tack room, Claire's fingers flew over the keyboard, the familiar dance of coding, a sharp contrast to the morning's physical labor. She'd created a series of dead drops across the dark web, accessible only through a complex series of security keys. If anyone from her trusted circle had received her message, there, buried in the code of an obscure weather website. A message from her father's old friend, Judge Williams. Package received. Wheels in motion. Stay dark. Relief flooded her, followed immediately by fear. If the judge was involved, things were moving faster than she'd anticipated. She needed to get to that safety deposit box in Jackson, but the roads would be watched. When she emerged from the tack room, Jack took one look at her face and nodded. "Bad news? Complicated news." She pulled Sarah's gloves back on, needing their solid comfort. "I have friends moving to help, but we need to move faster," Jack finished. "All right then. Miguel, start tacking up Thunder and Rose. Claire's getting her first riding lesson today." "What? No, I didn't mean—" "Can't always choose our timing." Jack's eyes crinkled. "Sometimes you just have to trust the tools you've got, whether they're old gloves or new friends." Claire looked down at her gloved hands, then back at Jack. In his world of dirt and leather and honest work, her corporate battles seemed simultaneously huge and insignificant, but maybe that was the point. Maybe she needed both worlds, the power to fight and the wisdom to know what she was fighting for. All right, she said, flexing her fingers in Sarah's gloves. Teach me to ride. Evening found them in Jack's living room, Claire's muscles aching from her first riding lesson. The leather-bound album lay heavy in her lap, a Morrison family history told in faded photographs and careful handwriting. Jack hadn't meant to share it, but the storm rolling in had driven them inside, and somehow talk of the past had led to this moment. "That's my grandfather," Jack said, pointing to a stern-faced man standing beside a much younger version of the barn. "Built this place with his own hands in 1947. Came back from the war determined to create something lasting." Claire traced the photograph's edge. "He looks formidable." "That's a diplomatic way of putting it," Jack chuckled. "Man was harder than winter iron, but he loved this land. Taught my father everything he knew, who taught me in turn." She turned the page, finding a wedding photo. A young Jack, clean-shaven and almost unrecognizable in a suit, stood beaming beside a beautiful woman with laughing eyes. Sarah, first. "In time I saw her, she was telling off a drunk cowboy at the county fair," Jack said softly. "Had more fire in her than anyone I'd ever met. Took me 3 months to work up the courage to ask her out." "She's beautiful," Claire murmured. "How long were you married?" 22 years. Not long enough." He reached over, turning to another page. "Here's the day we saved the South pasture. Massive wildfire coming through. Whole community showed up to help dig fire breaks. Sarah organized everything. Food, water, schedules, kept us going for 3 days straight." Thunder rolled outside as Claire studied the photos of smoke-stained faces and determined smiles. So different from the corporate team-building events she was used to, where alliance and betrayal danced beneath polite veneers. "My father would have loved this place," she said suddenly. "He grew up on a farm in Ohio. Used to tell me stories about harvest time, about how a community comes together when it matters. I never really understood until now." Jack settled back in his chair, watching her turn the pages. "Tell me about him. The real him, not the business legend." Claire smiled, remembering. "He used to take me camping every summer, just the two of us. Said it was to remind us what was real. Even after the company got big, he insisted on keeping his old pickup truck. Used to drive the board members crazy, having their CEO show up to meetings in a 20-year-old Ford. Sounds like a man who knew his priorities. He tried to teach me." Her fingers found a photo of Jack and Sarah working on a tractor together. "I was so focused on proving myself, on showing I could run the company as well as any man, that I forgot what he was really trying to say. It's not about the empire you build. It's about the foundation you build it on." Lightning flashed, illuminating the room. In that brief, bright moment, Jack saw something shift in Claire's expression. "What is it?" "The last thing he said to me," she said slowly. "The day before he died, he was trying to tell me about the board's plans, but he was so weak. All he could say was, 'Check the foundation.' I thought he was delirious, but now—" She sat up straighter. "The company's original incorporation papers, they're in a vault at our first office building, the one he built himself. If the board's been operating illegally, any changes they made would have to be documented there. I thought you already had proof in that safety deposit box? Financial records, mostly. Enough to raise questions, start investigations. But the original papers, those would show if they changed the company's fundamental structure without proper authorization. That's why they wanted me declared incompetent instead of just firing me. They needed my signature for something." Jack absorbed this, then stood and walked to the window. The storm was intensifying, sheets of rain obscuring the view. "Jackson's being watched. That old office building probably is, too." "Yes." He turned back to her, his expression determined. "Good thing you're learning to ride, then. Horses don't show up on surveillance cameras." Claire closed the album gently. "Jack, I can't ask you to risk more than you already have." "You're not asking, I'm offering." He sat beside her, the old couch creaking under his weight. "My grandfather didn't build this ranch to last 3 generations just to see it torn down for some corporate scheme. And your father didn't build his company to see it used for stealing other people's legacies." Their eyes met in the lamplight, and something unspoken passed between them. Claire felt her heart skip, a feeling that had nothing to do with corporate intrigue and everything to do with the way Jack was looking at her. Thunder crashed again, and the lights flickered once before dying completely. In the sudden darkness, Claire felt Jack's hand find hers, steady and sure. "Stay here," he said. "I know where the lanterns are." But neither of them moved. Their hands still joined in the dark, the family album a warm weight across their laps. Outside, the storm raged on, but in that moment Claire felt safer than she had in months. The power came back with a hum, but something had changed in the room. Jack cleared his throat and stood, carefully setting the album aside. "Should check on the horses. Storm like this makes them nervous." "I'll come with you," Claire said, rising. "After all, I need to practice if we're planning a covert operation." Jack's laugh was warm and genuine. "Covert operation? Listen to you, sounding like some spy novel." "Well," she smiled, "I did recently stage my own disappearance and go into hiding on a ranch. I think I'm allowed a little dramatic flair." They stepped out onto the covered porch, watching the rain. The barn lights glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of warmth and safety. Like the photos in the album, Claire thought, some things stand the test of time if they're built on the right foundation. The business proposal arrived by courier the next morning, a thick envelope of legal papers wrapped in corporate promises. Jack spread them across the kitchen table while Claire read over his shoulder, her tech CEO instincts coming alive at the sight of familiar contractual language. "Notice how they've buried the water rights transfer in subsection 12B? She pointed to a dense paragraph of legal text. "Most ranchers wouldn't even notice they're signing away their groundwater access along with the land." Jack frowned at the numbers on the front page. 7 million now, up from 5 last week. He ran a hand through his hair. "Getting desperate, aren't they? Or confident?" Claire pulled out her own chair, years of boardroom negotiations flooding back. This kind of aggressive escalation usually means they're working on a deadline. The question is, why? Miguel appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "Jefe, you need to see this." He handed over his tablet, showing a local news website. "They're building something big over in Johnson County, just broke ground yesterday." The article detailed the construction of a massive data center, supposedly for cloud computing services. Claire's fingers tightened on the proposal papers. That's it. They're not just after your water rights. They're creating a network. Data centers need enormous amounts of cooling. If they control enough groundwater sources, they could build a whole string of these facilities, Jack finished, using ranches as cover, and nobody would look twice at agricultural water usage. Claire stood and began pacing, CEO mode fully engaged. "This is brilliant, actually. Evil, but brilliant. They're probably routing the real construction through shell companies, hiding the true water consumption in agricultural reports." A truck. Dodo slammed outside. Through the window, they saw Walsh, the corporate security chief, stepping out of a black SUV. This time, he wasn't alone. Claire recognized Thomas Green, one of her board members, in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous against the dusty ranch backdrop. "Back door," Jack said quietly. "Miguel, get her to the cabin." "No." Claire straightened her shoulders. "I need to hear this. They won't recognize me like this." She gestured to her work clothes and dirt-smudged face. "Trust me." Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Stay quiet. Follow my lead." The knock, when it came, managed to sound both polite and threatening. Jack opened the door with his best poker face. "Gentlemen, Mr. Morrison." Green's smile was pure corporate. "Shark, I hope we're not interrupting your morning. I'm Thomas Green, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development for Harrison Tech Industries. I believe you've met Mr. Walsh. Come to up your offer again." Jack leaned against the doorframe, deliberately casual. "Actually, we've come with a concern." Green's eyes swept the kitchen, landing briefly on Claire before dismissing her as unimportant. "We've had reports of a person of interest in the area, someone who might try to interfere with our development plans." Claire kept her Head down, pretending to study the proposal papers. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Walsh's gaze passed over her again. "Lot of strangers passing through lately," Jack said neutrally. "Something about the rodeo season." Green placed a photo on the table, a surveillance shot of Claire in full corporate attire taken months ago. "This woman is Claire Harrison. She's experiencing some emotional difficulties following her father's death. Her family is very concerned." Her family. Jack's voice carried just the right amount of skepticism. "Thought she was the last Harrison." A flicker of annoyance crossed Green's face. "The company is her family. We've watched her become increasingly unstable, making wild accusations, threatening to destroy her father's legacy. We only want to help her. By buying up every ranch in 3 counties? Progress requires change, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you'll profit from that change or be crushed by it." Green straightened his Italian silk tie. "The offer on your table, it expires at midnight. After that, well, banks can be so unpredictable these days. Foreclosures, asset seizures, messy business." Jack's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That a threat, Mr. Green?" "An observation. Along with another, helping a fugitive CEO hide from her responsibilities would be," he smiled thinly, "unfortunate for all involved. Good day, Mr. Morrison." After they left, Claire waited until their SUV disappeared down the drive before releasing her breath. "Thomas Green," she said quietly, "the man who was like an uncle to me, who came to every Christmas dinner for 15 years, just threatened to destroy your life to get to me." Jack watched the dust settle on the drive. "Seems to me he already destroyed his own life, just doesn't know it yet." He turned to her. "You okay?" Claire looked down at the proposal in her hands, seeing beyond the legal jargon to the human cost, hidden in its pages. How many other ranchers had faced similar threats? How many had given in, not understanding what they were really signing away? "I need paper," she said suddenly, "and access to Miguel's laptop. I know how to stop them." "The foundation documents?" Jack asked. "Better. I'm going to draft our own proposal, one that exposes their entire scheme." Her fingers itched for a keyboard. "Every shell company, every hidden water deal, every corrupt board member. By the time I'm done, this proposal will be a ticking time bomb wrapped in legal paper." Jack's slow smile held equal parts admiration and concern. "Sounds dangerous." "Everything worth fighting for is." She met his eyes. "Are you with me?" Instead of answering, Jack reached for his phone. "Let me call some neighbors. If we're going to blow this thing wide open, might as well make sure everyone knows what they're really signing away." Outside, storm clouds gathered again, but this time they felt like allies, like the calm before a justice long overdue. Claire looked at the proposal one last time before starting her counterattack. In trying to bury her, they'd forgotten who had taught her to read the fine print. It was time to remind them. After hours of drafting their counter-proposal, Claire's eyes burned from staring at the laptop screen. The sun had set, and Jack's neighbors had gone home, armed with new knowledge and determination. Now, the ranch was quiet, except for the gentle patter of rain on the roof. She found Jack in the living room, holding something she hadn't seen before, an old acoustic guitar, its wood worn smooth by years of loving use. His fingers traced the faded wildflowers painted along its edge. "Sarah's," he said, answering her unspoken question. "She used to play every evening. Said music was the best way to end a day, no matter how hard it had been. Did you ever learn?" A small smile crossed his face. "She tried to teach me. I was hopeless, but I loved to listen." He held the guitar out to Claire. "Do you play?" "A little. My father insisted on lessons. Said every CEO needs a way to stay human." She took the guitar carefully, feeling its history in her hands. "I haven't played in years, though. Would you?" He left the question hanging. Claire positioned the guitar, surprised at how naturally her fingers found their place. The strings were old but still in tune. Someone had been caring for this instrument. She strummed softly, letting muscle memory guide her through the opening chords of an old James Taylor song. "Fire and Rain," Jack recognized. Sarah loved that one. Claire's voice was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. Just yesterday morning, they let me know you were gone. The guitar's warm acoustics filled the room, and something in Jack's expression made her pause. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... No, he said quickly. Please, it's good to hear music in this room again. She continued playing, watching as Jack closed his eyes, lost in memory. When the song ended, the silence felt different, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. After Sarah died, Jack said finally, I packed away most of her things, but I couldn't put the guitar in storage. She'd have hated that, seeing it shut up in some box instead of making music. Tell me about her. Not just the photographs, but the real her. Jack settled into his chair, his eyes on the painted wildflowers. She was a force of nature. Taught third grade in town, but she was really teaching all of us. Had this way of seeing right through problems to solutions nobody else could spot. During the drought of 15, she started a program getting her kids to research water conservation. Ended up revolutionizing how half the county handled irrigation. Claire smiled, touching the guitar's strings lightly. Sounds like she would have solved our current problem in about 5 minutes. Probably. Jack laughed softly. She'd have marched right into that board meeting and shamed them all into doing right. His expression grew thoughtful. You remind me of her sometimes. Not in how you look or act, but in that steel inside, that certainty about what's right. I don't feel very certain most days, Claire admitted. Running a company, every decision affects thousands of lives. It's terrifying. But you make those decisions anyway. That's what matters. He reached over and touched the guitar's neck, his fingers close to hers. Sarah used to say courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Claire began playing again, softer this time, a melody she remembered her father humming in his workshop when she was small. Your father, Jack said. The real him, not the business. Legend. What would he think of all this? Claire's fingers stilled on the strings. He'd be heartbroken to see what they're trying to do with his company, but... She smiled slightly. He'd love this. Me hiding out on a ranch, learning to ride horses, fighting back with paperwork and principles. He always said the best view of a problem comes from outside the system. Smart man. He would have liked you. The words came out before she could. Stop them. Your integrity, your connection to the land. He always said you can't trust people who've never worked with their hands. Their eyes met over the guitar, and Claire felt that same electric connection from the storm night. Jack cleared his throat. Claire, Headlights swept across the windows. Miguel's warning whistle pierced the night. 2 short bursts. Someone coming up the drive. They moved quickly, efficiently. Claire set the guitar gently in its stand, while Jack doused the lights. In the darkness, his hand found hers, guiding her toward the back door. Security patrol, he whispered. They've been increasing their rounds. Through the window, they watched the slow pass of another black SUV. Claire's fingers tightened on Jack's, and she felt his answering squeeze. When had this man's presence become such a source of strength? The SUV moved on, but they stayed there a moment longer. Hands joined in the dark. Finally, Jack stepped back. Should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be busy if we're really doing this. We are, Claire said firmly. No more hiding, no more letting them threaten good people. He nodded, then surprised her by reaching out to touch her cheek softly. Sarah would have liked you too, not just for your courage, for bringing music back to this house. After he left, Claire sat alone in the dark, her fingers still feeling the ghost of guitar strings and the warmth of Jack's hand. Tomorrow they would fight battles and face dangers, but tonight, in this room where love and loss had lived, something new was taking root. Something as gentle as guitar music and as strong as the truths they were fighting to protect. The letter arrived in an unmarked envelope, slipped under the cabin door, sometime during the night. Claire found it while checking the perimeter at dawn, her new ranch-honed instincts making her pause before touching it. The paper was expensive, the kind used in her company's executive offices. "Jack," she called softly, not taking her eyes off the envelope. He materialized from the morning mist, rifle ready. "Miguel's been watching all night," he said. "Nobody came near the cabin." "Somebody did," she pointed to the envelope. Jack retrieved it carefully by the corner, checking for any signs of tampering before handing it to her. The letter inside was typed on Harrison Tech letterhead, but the signature line was blank. Claire's hands shook as she read, "Claire, by the time you read this, the board will have voted to approve Project Aquifer. What you discovered about the water rights is only the surface. The data centers aren't for cloud computing. They're covers for something called Operation Watershed. I don't know the full scope, but I found references to military contracts and something called Resource Control Infrastructure. Your father discovered this last year. The cancer story was a lie. The night before he died, he tried to transfer controlling shares to you, but the documents were altered after his death. The lawyer who handled the transfer, James Chen, died in a robbery 2 weeks later. I'm risking everything sending this. Trust no one on the board, especially Victor. He's been the architect of everything. Victor Reed, her mentor, the man who had guided her career since she was fresh out of business school. The man who had held her while she cried at her father's funeral. "Claire," Jack's voice seemed to come from far away. "Talk to me. It's worse than we thought." She handed him the letter. "They killed my father. And Victor, he's been behind it all." Jack read quickly, his expression darkening. "Military contracts, resource control. Water is the next oil." Claire's mind raced. "Control enough of it. You control everything. They're not just after your ranch. They're building a private infrastructure to control water resources across the entire region." She looked up at him. "And they killed my father to do it." The morning sun caught the letter's watermark, the familiar Harrison Tech logo she'd grown up seeing on her father's desk. But now it felt tainted, twisted into something unrecognizable. "The safety deposit box in Jackson," she said suddenly. "We can't wait any longer. The documents I have might prove the altered transfer, show what really happened to my father." Jack folded the letter carefully. "Place'll be watched." "I know, but now we know why they're so desperate to find me." She met his eyes. "Still want to help a fugitive CEO?" His answer was cut short by Miguel's approach, running at full speed from the main house. "Jefe, news from town. The bank's called. In your loan. They're moving to foreclose by end of week." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. This was her fault. They were punishing Jack for helping her, but Jack's expression showed no blame, only determination. "Guess we're doing this today then." He checked his watch. "Bank opens in 2 hours. Miguel, get the horses ready. Claire," he turned to her, his eyes softening. "Sure you're ready for this?" She picked up the letter, her father's murder confession, and touched the corporate letterhead one last time before crumpling it. "They took my father. They're trying to take your ranch. I'm done being ready. I'm getting justice." The sun crested the mountains, painting the ranch in gold. Somewhere in Jackson, a safety deposit box held the truth, and somewhere in a corporate boardroom, Victor Reed was about to learn that some betrayals come with a price. The ride to Jackson took 2 hours through back trails, Claire clinging to Jack as his horse navigated terrain no SUV could follow. They left Miguel watching the ranch, his phone ready to warn them of any corporate visitors. The USB drive hung heavy around Claire's neck, disguised as a simple pendant, the last gift her father had given her. "Never remove it," he'd said, his voice already weakening. "Everything's there if you know how to look." Now, in a back room of the local library, Claire's fingers flew across a borrowed laptop. The drive's encryption yielded to a password only. She would know. The coordinates of that camping spot where they'd spent every summer. "My God," she whispered as the files opened. Jack stood watch by the door but turned at her tone. "It's all here. Everything." The drive contained thousands of documents, internal memos, secret board meetings, military contracts. Project Aquifer wasn't just about controlling water. It was about controlling people. The data centers were designed to monitor and regulate water access across 5 states, creating an invisible infrastructure of control. "Look at this," Claire pointed to a memo. "They've already started in California. Small towns experiencing mysterious water shortages, forced to pay premium rates to private contractors, all shell companies owned by board members. And your father found all this?" "He did more than find it." She opened another file. A video recording. Her father's face filled the screen, gaunt but determined. "Claire, if you're watching this, they got to me before I could stop them. Victor Reed isn't just my betrayer. He's working with a private military contractor called Watershed Securities. They're using our company's technology to create a water control system that could hold entire regions hostage. The evidence is all here, including the real documents they altered after they deal with me. Remember what I taught you about foundations, sweetheart. Everything that matters is in the roots." The video ended. Claire sat back, tears burning her eyes. He knew they were going to kill him. He was trying to warn me about the original incorporation documents. Jack squeezed her shoulder, then stiffened. At a sound from the hallway, footsteps approaching. Claire quickly encrypted the drive and slipped it back around her neck. They made it to the fire escape just as Walsh's voice carried from inside the library. "Check every computer. She's been accessing our network from somewhere in town." On the street, they blended with the tourist crowd, making their way to where Miguel's cousin had parked a getaway truck. But Claire couldn't shake her father's last words. "The roots," she said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "Jack, we've been looking at this wrong. We don't need the safety deposit box. The original documents aren't in a bank. They're at the old office building, in the foundation." "What do you mean?" "Dad built that first office himself. He always joked about burying a time capsule in the foundation," but her eyes lit up. "He wasn't joking. That's what he meant about checking. The foundation, the real documents, the original ownership papers. He literally buried them in the building's foundation." Jack checked his watch. "Construction crew starts demolition on that building tomorrow, part of the new data center project." Claire met his eyes, seeing her own determination reflected there. "Then we'd better get there tonight." Behind them, Walsh emerged from the library, scanning the crowd. But Jack and Claire were already gone, racing toward a truth buried in concrete and betrayal, hoping they weren't too late to save not just a ranch, but an entire region from a conspiracy built on stolen water and spilled blood. The motel room walls had disappeared under a web of documents. Property deeds, water rights certificates, corporate filings, and satellite maps. Claire stood in the center of it all, connecting threads of evidence while Jack worked his phone, rallying local ranchers to their cause. "Got the construction plans," Miguel's cousin Eddie said, shouldering through the door with a rolled blueprint. He worked maintenance at the old Harrison building. "Security's tight, but there's a way in. Through the old service tunnels. They haven't sealed those yet." Claire traced the tunnel route with her finger. "Dad used to tell me stories about these. Said they built them extra wide because he was convinced personal computers would be the size of refrigerators." She smiled at the memory, then refocused. "The foundation documents would be here, under the cornerstone. 2 guards on rotation," Eddie reported. "But they're focused on the main entrances. Nobody's watching the tunnel access behind Philip's storage." Jack hung up his phone. "Sheriff Thompson's on board. Showed him the evidence about the water. Right scheme. He's got deputies ready to move when we give the signal." Claire nodded, shuffling through a stack of legal papers. Her father's old lawyer had been thorough. Every document needed to prove the board's illegal actions was here, just waiting for the original incorporation papers to complete the puzzle. "Victor will be ready for something," she said. "He doesn't make mistakes. Good thing we're not playing by his rules, then." Jack spread out the property map. "While they're watching banks and airports, we're going in through a maintenance tunnel with a crowbar and a prayer. Just like your grandfather would have done," Miguel added from his post by the window. Claire caught Jack's eye and saw his quick grin. "Yes, exactly like that." Corporate raiders with their algorithms and surveillance systems hadn't counted on old-school determination. She picked up the most damning document, proof that Victor had redirected company funds through a maze of shell companies, all leading back to Watershed Securities, the same company that had supplied the private security present the night her father died. "Once we have the original papers," she said, "we can prove they altered the share transfer. That makes every decision they've made since then illegal. The military contracts, the water rights purchases, all of it." "And the ranch?" Jack asked quietly. Claire held up another document. The deed to the R, their entire house of cards is built on water rights. Once we expose the illegal transfers, every contract they've signed becomes void, including the bank loans they're using to pressure you. A police siren wailed in the distance, making them all tense. But it passed, and Claire returned to arranging the papers in sequence. Each one a bullet in the gun they were building, aimed straight at Victor Reed's empire. "You know," Jack said, watching her work, "for someone who grew up in boardrooms, you're pretty good at this outlaws and rebels thing. Turns out running a multi-billion-dollar company is just advanced problem-solving." She straightened a crooked page. "Dad always said the principles are the same, whether you're herding cattle or managing executives. Smart man." "Yes." Claire touched her father's signature on an old contract. "He was also right about another thing. Some battles you can't win alone." The room fell quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the soft murmur of Miguel coordinating with the sheriff's office. In a few hours, they would attempt something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. But looking at the evidence surrounding them, Claire felt a certainty she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. "Time to move," Eddie said, checking his watch. "Construction crew starts at dawn." They gathered the essential documents, Claire tucking them into a waterproof case. Everything else would go to Judge Williams as backup. Jack helped her shrug into a dark jacket, his hands lingering on her shoulders. "Ready?" She thought of her father's last message, of Jack's quiet strength, of all the people counting on them to stop Victor's scheme. "Ready." Outside, the night air carried the scent of sage and coming rain. Somewhere across town, in the building where her father had started it all, the truth waited in concrete and steel. Claire touched the USB drive at her neck, feeling like both the CEO she'd been raised to be and the outlaw she'd become. Time to go back to the beginning. Time to set things right. The old ranch deed lay between them on the truck's dashboard, its edges worn soft with age. 3 generations of Morrisons had protected this paper, this promise of land and legacy. As they parked in the shadows behind Philip's storage, Jack touched it one last time. "Grandfather signed this in 1947, he said quietly. "Said a man's word and his land were all he really had in this world." Claire studied the flowing script in the moonlight. "After tonight, they'll never threaten either." Again, Eddie's voice crackled through their borrowed radio. "Security's changing shifts. You've got 12 minutes to reach the tunnel entrance." They moved like shadows through the storage yard, Claire carrying the waterproof case of documents, Jack with tools for accessing the foundation. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Eddie had marked it, a maintenance hatch nearly hidden by years of debris. "Your father really built all this?" Jack asked as they descended into the darkness. "Built it, wired it, plumbed it himself." Claire's flashlight beam caught old electrical conduits. "Said you can't trust what you haven't built with your own hands. Guess he meant that literally with these documents." The tunnel air was thick, with decades of dust. Their footsteps, no matter how careful, echoed off concrete walls. Every sound made them freeze, listening for pursuit. But they reached the building's foundation, unbothered. Here, Claire touched a section of wall. The cornerstone would be just on the other side. Dad used to tap this wall during board meetings when he was thinking. Said it helped him remember what mattered. Jack unfolded Eddie's blueprint, tracing their location. "If your father left something in the foundation, it would be behind this section. But breaking through will make noise," Claire finished. "We'll have minutes at most before security investigates." They shared a look in the flashlight's glow. Everything hinged on this moment. The ranch, the water rights, Justice for Claire's father. Jack pulled out the ranch deed one last time. "Whatever happens up there," he said, "know that you've already saved more than just my land. You showed us all what we're really fighting for." Claire took the deed from him gently, adding it to her waterproof case. "We're not done fighting yet." She reached up and removed the USB drive from around her neck, pressing it into his hand. "If anything happens to me, get this to Judge Williams. It's everything my father found, everything they killed him to hide. Claire, promise me, Jack, the truth has to come out, even if—" He cut her off by pulling her close, his kiss carrying all the words they hadn't said. When they parted, her hands were gripping his jacket, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Together," he said firmly. "We finish this together." The radio crackled. Eddie's voice was urgent. Movement at the front gate. Black SUVs arriving. "Looks like Walsh and Victor Reed himself." Claire's breath caught. Of course Victor would come. He'd want to oversee the demolition personally, ensure nothing remained of Harrison Tech's humble beginnings. "Early for the construction crew," Jack noted. "They must know we're coming. Someone tipped them off." Claire checked her watch. "Dawn's in 90 minutes. We need those documents before they start demolition." Jack readied the tools. Noise discipline is blown anyway. Might as well make it count. Above them, footsteps echoed through the building. Claire thought of her father tapping this wall, of Jack's grandfather signing that deed, of all the promises kept and broken that had led to this moment. "Dad believed in building things to last," she whispered. "Time to find out if he built this wall as solid as his principles." Jack positioned. "The drill against the concrete. Your father, my grandfather, they did their part. Built the foundations we're standing on. Now it's our turn." Claire squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of their combined legacies. A CEO and a rancher, about to break into a building's foundation on the word of a dead man's riddle. It sounded crazy, but then so was everything else about this past week. "Do it," she said. The drill's whine cut through decades of silence, racing them toward either salvation or ruin. But with Jack beside her, the ranch deeds safely stored with their evidence, Claire finally understood what her father had tried to teach her. Some things were worth risking everything for. Above them, Victor Reed's voice carried faintly through. "The floors. Start the demolition as soon as there's light. I want this building's foundation reduced to rubble by noon." Claire met Jack's eyes in the darkness. Time to see what her father had buried in these walls. Time to bring it all down. Or save it all together. The concrete finally yielded with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire building. Claire's hands trembled as she reached into the cavity Jack had created, her fingers finding a metal box sealed with her father's personal logo. "Claire!" Jack's urgent whisper. "Someone's coming." She clutched the box to her chest as they pressed into an alcove. Flashlight beams swept the tunnel, security doing a final check before demolition. They held their breath, Claire feeling Jack's heart, hammering where her back pressed against his chest. The lights passed. They exhaled. The box's lock opened to her father's birth date. Inside, wrapped in plastic, lay the original incorporation documents, exactly as she remembered signing them. And beneath them, something else. Her old company. ID badge, the one she'd lost the day of her father's funeral. "He kept it," she whispered, touching the badge's surface. Her younger self smiled confidently from the photo, still believing in the company's bright future. "He knew I'd be back for these." Jack checked his watch. 40 minutes till dawn. "If we're doing this, it has to be now." Claire slipped the badge around her neck, feeling its weight like armor. "Call the sheriff. Tell him to move in as soon as he hears my signal, which is—" She smiled grimly. "He'll know it when Victor starts screaming." They split up, Jack heading to the security office to ensure their evidence reached the right hands, Claire taking the executive elevator, her badge still amazingly accessed. As she rose toward the top floor, she thought of all the times she'd made this climb, but never like this, with her father's true legacy literally in her hands. The elevator opened directly into the old boardroom. Victor Reed stood at the windows, watching the pre-dawn sky lighten. He didn't turn. "I wondered if you'd figure it out," he said calmly. "Harrison always did love his little puzzles. Like the puzzle of how his daughter somehow lost her controlling shares after his death." Claire's voice was steel. "Or the puzzle of why his lawyer died 2 weeks later." Now Victor turned, his familiar grandfatherly smile not quite reaching his eyes. "My dear, you're not well. The stress of losing your father, the pressure of running the company, it's clearly taken its toll. But we can help you. Like you helped my father?" She set the metal box on the conference table. "I have the original documents, Victor. The real ones, not your forged versions. And I have proof of everything: Project Aquifer, Watershed Securities, the military contracts. It's over." His smile didn't waver. "Over! Claire, it's barely begun. Look outside. What do you see? A dying town, failing ranches, people desperately clinging to a way of life that's already gone. We're not destroying anything. We're ushering in the future by stealing water rights, by killing anyone who stands in your way, by controlling the most precious resource of the next century." He spread his hands. "Your father was brilliant, but he was small-minded. All that innovation, that technology, wasted on making people's lives marginally better when we could be shaping the very future of this region." "You're right about one thing," Claire said, touching her recovered badge. "My father was brilliant. Brilliant enough to know you'd try something like this. Brilliant enough to leave a trail even you couldn't erase." She pressed the badge against the electronic lock of her father's old cabinet. It clicked open, revealing a safe she'd never known existed. Victor's composure cracked for the first time. "That's impossible. We changed all the security protocols." "Did you? Or did my father make you think you did?" She smiled. "He always said the best security isn't about technology. It's about knowing how people think." The safe contained a single USB drive, labeled in her father's handwriting, Plan B. "You know what's on this, don't you?" She held it up. "Every conversation you had in this room for the past 5 years, every corrupt deal, every death you ordered. My father never trusted you, Victor. He was gathering evidence the whole time." The sound of sirens rose from below. Through the window, Claire could see police cars surrounding the building. "Right on time, Jack." Victor's mask finally slipped, revealing something ugly beneath. "You really think you can win against everything we've built?" Claire squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of both her recovered badge and her father's final gift. "No, Victor, I think we already have." The sun crested the horizon, painting the boardroom in gold. Dawn had arrived, and with it, the light of truth her father had died protecting. Everything happened fast after that. Sheriff Thompson's deputies flooded the building, while FBI agents, secretly alerted by Judge Williams, took custody of both the evidence and Victor Reed. But it was the small velvet box in Jack's pocket, containing his grandmother's ring, that would truly mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Victor's face had gone from rage to calculation to defeat as he watched his empire crumble. "You have no idea what you've done," he said as agents led him past Claire. "The military contracts, the international agreements, it's bigger than just water rights now." "I know exactly what I've done," Claire replied, her recovered badge glinting in the morning light. "I've honored my father's legacy, the real one, not the twisted version you tried to create." The evidence was overwhelming. Claire's father hadn't just documented the corruption, he'd created a complete parallel record of every illegal decision, every foreclosed ranch, every diverted water right. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was already calling it one of the largest corporate conspiracy cases in recent history. Judge Williams arrived as the sun cleared the mountains, his usual judicial dignity cracking into a broad smile when he saw Claire. "Your father would be proud," he said, hugging her, "though I doubt he imagined you'd end up solving this from a ranch while learning to ride horses." Speaking of the ranch, Claire turned to find Jack coming through the doors, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the corporate setting, but carrying himself with quiet confidence. "Sheriff's got the bank president in custody," he reported. Seems he was on Victor's payroll, pushing for closures on specific ranches they wanted. He met Claire's eyes. The Triple R is safe. All the ranches are. The relief in the room was palpable, but Claire noticed Jack's hand kept straying to his pocket, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "There's something else," she said. "Yeah." He glanced around the crowded boardroom. "But not here. Come with me?" He led her to her father's old office, now dusty with disuse. The morning sun streamed through windows that had witnessed the birth of Harrison Tech, had watched her grow from a child playing under her father's desk to the CEO fighting to save his dream. Jack touched the worn desk edge. "Your father built all this from nothing, just like my grandfather built the ranch." He turned to face her. "Both of them knew something we almost forgot, that the most valuable things aren't the ones you can buy or sell." "Jack," he pulled out the velvet box. "I've been carrying this since the night you played Sarah's guitar. Wasn't sure I'd ever find the right moment, or if you'd even want to stay once this was all over." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring set with a small diamond. "My grandmother wore this for 60 years, working the ranch beside my grandfather. Sarah added these smaller stones when she accepted it, making it her own, while honoring its history." Claire's breath caught as he knelt, right there on the office floor where she'd learned to walk. "I know you have a company to rebuild," he said, "and I have a ranch to run. But maybe that's exactly why this works. Because we both understand what it means to be part of something bigger than ourselves." He held up the ring. "Claire Harrison, will you marry me? Not just me, but everything that comes with me. The ranch, the hard work, the early mornings, and late nights. Will you help me build something that'll last another 3 generations? Tears blurred her vision as she looked at the ring, this symbol of 2 families' legacies now intertwining. Through the window, she could see the mountains, where her father had taught her to camp, the ranch lands where Jack had taught her to ride. 2 worlds that had seemed so separate now, merging into something new and stronger. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed through her tears. "Yes to all of it. The ranch, the company, the legacy, everything." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been waiting for her all along. When Jack stood and pulled her close, she could feel both their hearts racing. A knock at the door revealed Judge Williams. "Sorry to interrupt, but the press is arriving. They'll want to hear from the CEO of Harrison Tech." Claire looked down at her dusty ranch clothes and laughed. "Some CEO? The best kind," Jack said, squeezing her hand. "One who knows what's worth fighting for." She touched the ring, feeling its history, its promise. Then she straightened her shoulders, ready to face the world not just as Claire Harrison, CEO, or as Jack Morrison's fiancée, but as both. A woman who had found her truest self in the space between boardrooms and barn doors. 1 month later, Miguel stood back to admire his handiwork. The new sign at the ranch entrance read, "Triple R Tech Ranch, Innovation Meets Tradition," in hand-carved letters. Below it, smaller text announced, "Home Office of Harrison Technologies, Sustainable Agriculture Division." "It's perfect," Claire said, wrapping an arm around Jack's waist. She'd just finished a video conference with the new board, running the company from what had once been Sarah's craft room. The original Harrison Tech building was now a historical landmark, protected from any future development. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and approaching snow as ranch hands and tech employees mingled by the corrals, sharing coffee and swapping stories. Claire's initiative to merge ranching wisdom with sustainable technology had drawn international attention, with other communities already requesting partnerships. "Your father would love this," Jack said, touching the small EH carved into the sign's corner, Claire's tribute to Edward Harrison's memory, a company that helps preserve ranching communities instead of destroying them. "And your grandfather?" Jack laughed. He'd probably grumble about computers in the barn, then secretly learn to code just to prove he could. Together, They watched the sun set behind mountains that had witnessed generations of both their families build, struggle, and endure. The ring on Claire's finger caught the fading light, its old stones and new still telling a story of legacies preserved and renewed. Steam rose from 2 coffee mugs on the porch railing. Sarah's old ceramic one, with the faded ranch brand, now Jack's daily companion. And beside it, the sleek Harrison Tech tumbler Claire couldn't quite give up. Like everything else in their life, the contrast somehow made perfect sense. "Board meeting at 10, Claire said, checking her tablet while adjusting the bridle on her horse. She'd finally mastered riding well enough to multitask. Then that group from Montana arrives to learn about our water conservation program. "Miguel can handle the tour," Jack replied, sipping from Sarah's mug. "Someone needs to check the new solar-powered irrigation system in the South Pasture." Claire smiled, knowing he just wanted an excuse to ride out together. 1 year into their marriage, they'd found their rhythm. Mornings for ranch work, afternoons for corporate duties, evenings for each other. The R Tech Ranch had become a model for sustainable agriculture, proving that progress didn't have to come at the cost of tradition. They finished their coffee as the sun painted the mountains gold, their mugs sitting close together on the railing, like the ring on Claire's finger, like the sign at the gate, like everything they'd built together, a perfect blend of past and future, of heritage and hope.